Hey, I see you out there. Many of you work in Ottawa or at Queen's Park. You're journalists, lobbyists, strategists, politicians, and high-powered business types. And you've got cell phones. So many cell phones. You got a cell phone for work and a cell phone for home stuff and maybe 3 or 4 burner phones for God knows what stuff. I don't judge. But there are so many young Canadians aging out of foster care who don't have access to the kinds of tools and technology they need to live independent lives. The TELUS Mobility for Good program provides Canada's most vulnerable youth with a fully subsidized cell phone and data plan at no cost, as well as training and tools to participate safely in our digital world. For young people leaving foster care, a phone is often their lifeline. TELUS Mobility for Good program is available to nearly 20,000 youth across the country and helps them build credit, search for somewhere to live, find education and job opportunities, and stay in communication with their support network when they're on their own for the very first time. And it's just one part of TELUS's Connecting for Good program, which helps bridge the digital divide and ensures that all Canadians, regardless of their location or circumstances, have access to the technology and resources they need to navigate the digital world with confidence. You'll be hearing more about this excellent program in the coming weeks, but to learn more right now, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. I now return you to your random scrolling, app opening, and podcast listening on one of your 2 to 5 cell phones. All right, folks, this is the Herle Burly, and you are listening to Cabinet Edition of the Herle Burly. This is our Cabinet Swearing-In special podcast, recorded just about 90 minutes after the conclusion of today's ceremonies. With me are the political panelists you've come to know and oddly fallen in love with, in the same way that you can fall in love with your own second cousin, and most of the family thinks that's okay. Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid.
I have a lot of second cousins.
Yeah, me too.
They might shift uncomfortably.
We're going to go to all the places the major networks can't or won't or are just too afraid to, which means this is going to be the most honest cabinet swearing-in analysis you're likely to hear. It's definitely going to be the sweariest cabinet swearing-in analysis out there. And because of that, Scott and Jenni, I think we need to do a little swear warm-up here. Some expletive aerobics, curse word cardio. I'm happy to start.
Okay.
If you're a regular listener, you know that I love the Saskatchewan Roughriders. A lot. Last Sunday's Western Division final, the Riders with the fucking ball inside the 10-yard line twice in the last 2 minutes. And what happens? Nothing. First time, they get their asses handed to them at the 1. Winnipeg goes 2 and out. Riders get the ball back. They drive down to the 8. Then Fajardo drops back, sets, throws a beautiful ball right into the fucking upright. 10 times they had the ball in the red zone during the game, and not one shitbiscuit touchdown to show for it. All right, I'm ready. You got anything to add, Scott? Jenni?
It's hard to follow that, but you know who's probably swearing tonight? And I will just say I predicted this was going to happen a month ago, and I was fucking right. Mike Babcock.
Mike Babcock. Big news, actually. I think the cabinet got blown out of the news in Toronto today anyway.
It sure did. I was driving down here, and you could not hear a word about the cabinet. People did not seem to be interested in who the Minister of Middle-Class Prosperity was. They were only concerned with Mike Babcock. And I think it's fucking strange, Bobcat Goldthwait. Right? Getting fired. Getting, as David would like us to say, in the calisthenics of cursing, fucking fired. But I think it's weird. Isn't it weird to fire him today? Like, I think I get you want to fire Babcock on account of all the shittiness, but they're on the road for like another 11 games. Don't you say, like, you know what, buddy, you wear all of it. Like, take all the trash to the curb, and then you're going to come back, and we're going to, Mike, could you meet us upstairs, like on the top of the water tower at midnight, right? Don't tell anyone you're coming. Leave your cell phone at home, and we're going to hit you with a shovel over the top of the fucking head, right? That's how you do this. Seems like an unstrategic firing.
I don't know. He'd obviously lost the locker room, right?
Well, listen, this was predictable. Like this, when I first moved here and people were walking around with his face on fucking socks, the Mike Babb socks or whatever, and he was the best. It's such a Toronto thing.
And he wouldn't play PK. Fuck you, Mike Babcock. and wouldn't play PK.
But it's typically Toronto. So instead of, dealing with Last year, they acquiesce and go overboard to get Nylander signed, and he had a shit season. Same with Marner, and now he had a shit first month, and now he's out for minimum 6 weeks. It's a very Toronto thing, and all the people that were walking around with the Mike Babs socks 2 years ago were the first ones calling for him publicly to be fired. So there's my rant on the fucking Toronto Maple Leafs.
Anyway, I'm drinking a Canadian today, so hopefully Montreal can find somebody who can score. Give them a little money. I like to support the team financially.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree. I just want to say on the Riders,
You know,
what's the name of the offensive coordinator again?
Stephen McAdoo.
Okay, McAdoo. Every once in a while, they would flip upstairs to McAdoo, and he'd be sitting there. And he appeared to have some papers and some pens, pencils, and writing instruments in front of him, right? What the fuck was he doing?
I don't know. The play calling was inexplicable. And he's not bothered to stand up and try to explain it either. All right. I think people probably tuned in to hear about the cabinet. So let's give the people what they want.
All right.
Right. So, Jenny, you were on TV all day, CP24, talking about this.
I was.
Let's start with this question. What were they trying to accomplish today?
Well, I think they were trying to accomplish. They wanted to. I think it was a definite reset. Although a lot more returning cabinet ministers than I think I've ever seen in terms of from one parliament to the next. So it was a reset. The tone and tenor of the whole day was so much different than what it was in 2015. It was less celebrity. It wasn't, when they were all walking in 2015 like a giant Reservoir Dogs type photo op.
Mr. Pink.
It's not what I thought of that day, but I hear
But
you.
it was so it was trying to do a reset, but also keeping all the virtue signaling and gender equality bullshit that Trudeau talks about.
Gender equality bullshit. Oh man.
No, it's true. But this is what I mean. Like, we can start right into it. Like, Bardish Chagger went from House Leader to the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth. Like, what is that? Like,
Well, there's a number of portfolios today that are not jobs.
Like, and Joyce Murray is another one, a very capable woman who is now the Minister of Digital Government.
Analog government. I'm fucking coming for you. Your days are numbered.
So it's the typical Trudeau stuff. It was a lot of virtue signaling. It was, yes, you have the same amount of men as women in cabinet, although the women disproportionately have what seems to be the made up cabinet roles, but they looked a little bit more somber and a little bit more serious.
Okay, Scott, what do you think they were trying to accomplish today?
I think they were trying to signal what the problems are. I mean, governments always like to pretend that they talk in terms of opportunity, but I think that governments respond to challenge. And I think that they look at what happened in the last election and they say, well, we got a couple of big problems on our hands. Most pointedly, most immediately, most dangerously is the problem, of course, of Alberta and Saskatchewan. A, they don't have any members from there, and that's obviously a political deficiency. B, they've got a very talented, very dexterous premier in Jason Kenney who can do you political damage on a daily basis if he chooses to walk up to a microphone, and he often does choose to do that. And three, it's right in contradiction to your fundamental policy program, which is, it's the oil patch, and it's going through this massive...
Oil barons, I heard.
Oil barons. So you're going through this decarbonizing process, and it's like, so all these people are going to be displaced. So I think, you see... I mean, there's really only one story. There's lots of... we can joke about digital government, the Minister of Middle-Class Prosperity, and...
Yes, we can.
Wiring life rafts together or whatever to Christ, But at the end of the day... Chrystia Freeland's the only story in this cabinet, and Chrystia Freeland is a response to that, right? She's a response to Western alienation and the situation in Alberta and Saskatchewan.
It's smart that the member from University Rosedale is the government's response.
Oh, maybe you didn't hear.
Western
she was
alienation.
born in Peace River. She's actually a Westerner. That's the way that's going to be.
But that's doing
I got to step in.
Okay.
But this is doing. But that's doing.
She is from Alberta. She has genuine Alberta roots.
Okay.
Right? Jonathan Wilkinson is from Saskatchewan and has genuine Saskatchewan roots.
I understand
I
that.
am from Saskatchewan, and
Right.
I have genuine Saskatchewan roots. And those people, if they're successful at claiming to be from Alberta and Saskatchewan in this issue, I'm going to go home and run for Premier of Saskatchewan.
Right.
Because
Yes.
none of us are from there anymore, and none of us can claim to represent that place. The best they could hope for is that they do such a good job that the provinces say, hey, they showed us the affinity for here.
It's the kind of thing
right?
that other
You
people
don't
acknowledge,
tell
you don't
people-
claim.
Totally right. Right. Absolutely right.
Yes.
So anyway, that if they overplay that, the government or the ministers themselves, that will set them back. That will be a big mistake.
But I think that's what it's about. So in response to your question, what were they trying to accomplish today? I think fundamentally, when you do a cabinet, you reveal what you think the problems are, and you put your best players on the spot where you think points need to be scored. They think points need to be scored on the intergovernmental front. They think they need to be scored on a domestic front. And so Chrystia Freeland is the story of the shuffle. But I will add one last thing,
Yep.
which I'm sure is going to, I'd be curious to hear what you guys say. I think it's too much, man. I think it's just too fucking much. She is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. She is the Deputy Prime Minister. She is still in charge of Canada-U.S. relations, and she's responsible for the ratification and finalization of USMCA, and she's the chair of the Cabinet Committee on the Economy and the Environment. She is
And
the
vice chair of P&P.
Right. So she is the minister of everything except my Aunt Doris's Methodist Church, right? She is the minister of all. I think in the world of expectations, I think that's a heavy burden to carry.
Well, did they release mandate letters today?
I didn't see
Don't
any.
think so.
Right. Like, what is her job? Like, what is she expected to do?
Exactly, because that's the question. Because we heard exactly what Scott just said about what is the expectation, but what is her mandate? Like, generally, intergovernmental affairs is a much smaller ministry because either it's a standalone ministry that is very administrative, because we know the Prime Minister ultimately is the intergovernmental affairs minister, him or herself.
Sorry, can I ask you that? Don't you think this means that he is trying to say, actually, I know that premiers usually want to go first minister, but I am telling you, she is actually going to do that job right now, at least in this first round.
But it's possible he's doing that.
In the way
but
that
I
Mulroney
actually
tried to do that with Clark in '91.
Yeah,
right?
but
So-
I think it's a mistake. Like, I don't think he can come out and say, okay, I have a Saskatchewan and Alberta problem. People really fucking hate my guts out there, like a lot. And what I'm going to do is I don't have the guts or the political acumen or the political drive to do it myself. Like, I'm not going to take my licks and go out and deal with Jason Kenney one-on-one, or I know he's met with Mo one-on-one, but I'm going to let my deputy. I just think it is
I don't think you
underplayed.
took any licks in that Mo meeting. But.
No, and I'm not saying, but eventually
Yeah.
there's going to have to. Like, there's all this pro forma bullshit that people are doing now. But at the end of the day, I think it sends a signal, if that's the case, if that's what he's doing, that Trudeau's not taking the concerns of Saskatchewan and Alberta seriously.
Well, I 100% agree with you that he cannot delegate Alberta and Saskatchewan to anybody.
Yes.
He doesn't have a minister, and he can't delegate them. That's his job, right? Regardless of
Yes.
what title anybody else has. In terms of the actual meetings, though, the actual getting along, it is possible that different personalities could work out better, right? Pierre Trudeau, the first Pierre Trudeau.
The first Pierre Trudeau.
The first Pierre Trudeau, yeah.
The other one. The other Trudeau.
Wacky Bennett in BC and Ross Thatcher in Saskatchewan hated his guts.
Yep.
So he delegated Turner to handle those relationships. So Turner was doing shuttle diplomacy, and when there was things to work out with Ross Thatcher in Saskatchewan or Wacky Bennett
Ross,
in BC.
I fucking love you.
Yeah. Well, in fact, in BC, it turned out to be Grace McCarthy most of the time that he worked with. In any event, don't look at me like that.
Where are you going with that? Simmer down. This
I don't
is
know.
a podcast. There's still boundaries.
I don't think Jill listens to the podcast, but in any event, so I could see maybe that Chrystia could get along with Kenny or Mo in a way that maybe Justin Trudeau can't get along with them, but he certainly can't delegate the fix to this.
Yes.
But I don't know, is her job to make the provinces get along, or is her job to find an economic policy and solution that unites the country? Because they're giving her some sort of economic responsibilities here, but then who's in charge of the economy? Is it Bill Morneau or is it Chrystia Freeland?
Well, to me, this is I really, really want to see the mandate letter, and then I want to see how the world unfolds for a little bit, because I want to see what the world's supposed to be according to the established mandate in the letter. But I also want to see how it unfolds practically, because I'm with you, and I'm with Jenni actually when it comes to what is
wait a second, which is
intergovernmental
it?
affairs. No, but they're both, because you make the point, Jenni, like intergovernmental affairs, right? It's a little bit of a phantom ministry, right? It's a creature of PCO for people that are interested in machinery of government. And, to me, the big question really is her job is she supposed to go out there and make peace with them and go, hi, I'm the minister of getting along now. And so what would you like? What's your price? Well, that's a dangerous game to play with a couple of premiers who, for rational reasons, might think that it's in their political interest to not get along, right? Or is her job to expose the fact that they don't wish to get along so as to position the government as, we're doing our best we can, and we're being put in an intransigent position? I don't know. But I do know, ultimately, the things that are going to matter are a massive investment in some kind of transformation and adjustment program that, for the oil patch. I know that equalization is going to continue to be a point of friction, and they're going to have to do that. That's in finance, right? So is she going to be able to go to all the ministers that have control over those things and say, I'm sorry, but my position as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of this problem dictate that I get to pull on the levers that are in your building? That's the implication right now.
I agree.
And who knows? And if you look at the regional representation, there is not one economic minister west of Ontario. Not one economic minister.
Unless you count Wilkinson.
I think you have to count Wilkinson, to be honest.
But environment and climate change is not an it's not an economic ministry. Well, I guess we can see what.
I think they're going to have to remake it into. I think that's their conception of it, right?
Or maybe we're giving them too much credit. But there is no economic ministry in the West at all. So there's no.
Right.
Yeah.
I think technically digital government is looked upon as a very economic ministry,
Especially in BC, they're very highly focused on that out there.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Big BC representation.
Not digital economy, but digital government.
Right. Mm-hmm. What do you think they did well today? Scott, you start. What's something that you liked about the cabinet today?
I liked two things that they did. I liked the way that they preconditioned the cabinet shuffle, the cabinet composition, I guess. It's not really a shuffle. So I like the fact that in contrast to what the Trudeau governments the past have done, they actually told people in advance, here's what a bunch of people are. So they leaked bits and pieces, and they preserved the Freeland piece as much as they could so that she was the big news of the day. Because, let's face it, if she's the story of the day, then make her the story of the day. And be honest with yourself that that's the story of the day. There's nothing I hate more than this blurred strategic shit where people go, well, there's so many great stories, I can't pick one. No, fuck off, right? The story of the day is the response to the election result with Chrystia Freeland. That's the fundamental big story. And I like the fact that they leaked a bunch of other stuff so that they could isolate that. I also liked the way that they withheld the Prime Minister. Right? I like the way that the Prime Minister did not march down the drive at Reid Hall in the way that he did in 2015, where he was the sun and the stars and the moon and the sky. But it was a more humble, more understated play. It felt more like a second term than a first term, so I was glad that they did that. And I thought, after the slight short sheeting that the voters gave the government, that a little, let's cool it made sense. So they put the ministers in the window, and even the Prime Minister's scrum, the Prime Minister's availability was relatively succinct. So I like a bunch of the tactical things. The final thing I really, really, really liked. I know this is going to sound really Homer. I really like the appointment of Marco Mendicino, and I'll tell you why. It's not just because he's my buddy. Okay, it's a Jenni issue.
Talk to me of Mendicino.
No, I agree. I was going to say this is a smart.
Talk to me of Mendicino.
Okay, so first of all, he's a lovely guy. Okay, right. He's a friend of mine, and he didn't start out as a friend of mine. He became a friend of mine. So I mean, that tells you something, because not many people after they meet me like me, and so that speaks to him. But
that's a real danger of going on video here. With this podcast.
For sure. Yeah. Right, I'm gonna really repel folks, but. But Marco is the epitome of the hardworking, motivated caucus member, right?
Yep.
He starts out as a member of parliament in 2015. All he does is work like hell to win the nomination against a bunch of odds. He works like hell once he's there to become...
Eve Adams, right?
Eve
Let's
Adams.
remember who he
Eve
beat.
Adams.
He was a
the
giant
Dimitri
killer.
Soudris, triangle of love and scandal and villainy and whatever the fuck that all was.
You know not to sidebar when Eve crossed the floor, I sent a bouquet of flowers to Jerry Butts thanking him. For her.
So he wasn't the party's choice, but that's a remarkable thing. You think about the hurdles this guy's come over. So the party choice for the nomination was Eve Adams, the floor crosser, right? He wins the nomination, right? He becomes
By that point, the party's probably happy with that.
Well, they're starting to go like, holy moly, man, this is kind of a problem.
Yeah.
And so then he becomes the Ontario caucus chair. Then he becomes just a kind of the low-level fixer on a bunch of stuff. We need a guy to throw on top of a problem. We need a guy to talk about the small business changes and just try to go out there and mediate stuff. We need a guy to move from one PS job to another PS job. So he does all that stuff, and he never gets rewarded with a cabinet post in any of the subsequent shuffles. I think when you move to a minority government, caucus management becomes something you got to be conscious about. So you take a guy like Marco, who works tirelessly, demonstrates that he's a good soldier. I think one of the dangers of being prime minister is when you don't reward people like that. The signal you send to caucus members in large part is it doesn't matter whether you're a good player or a bad player, none of it gets rewarded. So I think rewarding a good player, rewarding a good guy like Marco is a nice signal going into a minority government.
I 100% agree. I think that when you looked at the first iteration, the 2015 cabinet, he was someone that was passed over probably for geography. Like he was one of the Crown prosecutor on the Toronto 18, the terrorist trial when the cell was found that was going to come and murder Prime Minister Harper in 2006, 2007. Yeah. And so I think I agree with Scott. It sends a great message. It reminded me similarly, and people might forget this, in our first cabinet in 2006, Jason Kenney was a parliamentary secretary. And we had a wealth of experience in Alberta, and there were a lot of people after that, when the cabinet was announced, that were very upset, noses out of joint. They felt that they were personal friends of the Prime Minister. They felt that they earned it, but geography was an issue for us in Alberta. Jason never once complained. He was made the parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister. He never once complained. He did the same. He worked hard. He continued being very political. A year later, he was made the Minister of State for Multiculturalism and Canadian Heritage. And a year later, he became one of the most senior cabinet ministers and remained so and most influential for the entire time that we were in government. So
Just think, if he'd only handled that the way Maurizio Bevilacqua did, he could have been the mayor of a small municipality.
So can we stop? Can we pause
absolutely.
for a moment and tell a story? So tell a tale out of school. Cabinet formation.
Yay.
Okay. So cabinet formation, 2003. Paul Martin's elected prime minister. Well, no, actually, that's not exactly what happened. He's elected leader of the party, becomes prime minister. And so we're going through transition, right? And they give us this suite of offices over in the Confederation building, which were awesome because they had an inner office for Paul as prime minister, but then they had an outer office for a bunch of the rest of us. We'd sit around at assembled desk and stuff. So we're trying to manage all the transition stuff. But what was most awesome about that office was that it had a padded door. I'll always remember that. It had a padded door like M's door in the Bond films, right? It was like, you walk in there in the morning, you'd expect Moneypenny to be going, oh, James, will you take me away this weekend? Right? Oh, Moneypenny, I wouldn't break up what we've got going, but so we're putting together the first cabinet, and we have to make this difficult decision about all these various players and who you leave out. I mean, that's the worst part and the most taxing part on prime ministers is who to leave out. And so they leave out Maurizio, and the view was that, I know the prime minister's view, David, you can endorse this, right? Like the view was, we'll make Maurizio the PS to the prime minister. And that is a clear signal that he is next in line to become a minister.
But he had, just to be clear, he had been raising huge amounts of money for years by telling everybody he was going to be the Minister of Finance when Paul Martin became the Prime
Absolutely, he
Minister.
had, right?
Yeah.
And he had. I'm going to be the Minister of Finance, and and Mauricio's a good guy. I don't want to rain on the guy, but he'd also through the leadership, he'd gotten a little bit shaky through the leadership wars there, and so then he goes in to see.
He wasn't quite sure how that was going to turn out.
Yeah, he wanted to see where
Yeah.
the softest landing was going to be before he jumped, and then so he goes in to see the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister says. So I got this great idea. I can't put you in cabinet right away, but I'm going to make you the parliamentary secretary to me, and I'm going to make all the parliamentary secretaries privy councillors, so it's awesome and it rocks. And you're going to be that, and then you'll be as long
Someday
as
something.
Yeah, and if you don't piss into the wind all over yourself, then you're going to be a minister. And he did not expect that and did not like that. And when he left that room, it did not go well in the outer office.
No, he just turned on his heel and left, did he not?
He turned on his heel, and then he turned and looked at, I think it was me, Tim, and Michelle. Me, Tim, Murphy, and Michelle Cadario was sitting in the outer office at desks. And he looked at us that way that the Warner Brothers DC Superman movies, when he would, so he'd pause for a second, there'd be this elaborate moment where nothing would happen, and then his eyes would turn red and things would explode, right? And that's how he looked at us. Unfortunately, we were not incinerated, but had he been born on Krypton, we would have been fucking gone for.
Canada's loss is Vaughan's gain. And I have to, at this moment, pause briefly for a word from our sponsor. Jenny, would you like to read this, or should I?
You can go right ahead.
Thank you very much. 16 years ago, what was happening? 16 years ago, Scott and I were engaged in a pitched battle for the governance of this country. Knife fight against each other. 16 years ago. And look how much has changed. We're all getting along famously now. Well, that's how long 16 years is. And 16 years is the last time the rules governing realtors were set. The real estate market has obviously changed tremendously, as has politics in Canada since then. The rules for the industry should be updated, and the Ontario Real Estate Association has a plan to do that. The OREA plan will increase professionalism in the industry, which is what realtors want and what home buyers and sellers deserve. What's important is that we protect the consumer by raising the bar on education, strengthening professional standards, and holding those who break the rules to the highest level of discipline. That's the plan the Ontario Real Estate Association has taken to Queen's Park. Go to rebareform.ca to learn more. Thank you, Aurea. And now, Jenni Byrne, tell me something that you liked about the Cabinet Shuffle.
Well, I didn't like anything, generally. But I think there were some, what I'll say is some smart moves. I think that, we've already talked about Marco. I think making someone like Pablo Rodriguez as the, is that his name?
Pablo Rodriguez.
That is his name.
Pablo Rodriguez was never called an asshole, not like you. Remember that? Jonathan Richmond and the Modern Lovers.
I think making him House Leader was smart. I think it's a whole different ball of wax in a minority parliament. I think he's one of the few people in caucus that have actually lived through minority years. He did an opposition with us, fluently bilingual, Quebec, so relationship with the
Charming
Bloc,
guy.
being charming guy.
Charming, hard to dislike that guy.
Like
He's a great guy.
relationships with different parties. So I think it was a smart move because it's going to be such a different role than what the House Leader's position was before. And even though the Liberals had a massive majority, there were some tight calls where they were outmaneuvered by the Conservatives and they almost lost votes, even having a majority. So I think that was a smart move.
On Pablo, can I ask you this? What do you think about political ministers? So in the first
Yep.
Justin Trudeau government, they didn't assign anybody responsibility for the political affairs in any of the provinces,
Yes.
including not having a Quebec lieutenant.
Yes.
So now Pablo is named the Quebec lieutenant because the Quebec wing of the Liberal Party just insisted on it.
Okay.
Oh, is that right? Has he been
yeah.
officially named lieutenant?
He's officially.
I didn't know that.
He's officially Quebec lieutenant, and that was because after the election, everybody who's in the party went to the PMO and the Prime Minister and said, "Listen, this isn't working. You got to have a Quebec lieutenant."
Okay.
But however, they don't have a political minister for Ontario or for British
Yeah.
Columbia. How do you feel about political ministers? Are they important?
I do think they're important. They are important. It adds. I found that it adds. Listen, political
Jen,
ministers.
can I ask you a question, Jenny? I don't think that a lot of people listening know what a political minister is.
So basically,
seriously, probably people don't know.
Sorry.
So explain
So the political ministries for us, every province had what they call a minister's regional office, and for every province, we would have a senior minister where there was a senior minister that was named on top of all their other responsibilities. They were made political minister for X.
So they have to sign off on political appointments, as an example. Kind of thing, right?
They would sign off on political appointments. They would generate lists. They would be the person that, if there was an issue that specifically was affecting a province, they would be the ones that you would liaison within the Prime Minister's office. I dealt with my first job when I was an advisor to Ian Brody when he was chief of staff. I was the one that was on daily contact with the MROs in terms of what issues were. And like, for example, Stockwell Day was the first regional minister of BC, so he had that on top of his his. And so
every previous government that I'm aware of had them.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. Sometimes they were not sometimes, often they were super powerful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it depended on it's the same as cabinet, right? It depended on personality. So, in Toronto, the GTA regional ministry was Jim Flaherty, and he was finance minister. He was a powerful force at the cabinet table, powerful force within the party. So he was a very powerful political minister.
Yeah.
Like, there was no one that was getting appointed to anything Jim cared about without Jim knowing about it.
Absolutely. And that was the same when Herb Gray was running Ontario for Pierre Trudeau.
Yeah.
Right.
But you think about Ouellette under...
Well, the Quebec lieutenants, first Lalonde and then Ouellette, they were absolutely in charge of...
They were mammoth figures.
Yeah, very. So why then, Scott, would they not want to have political ministers? Why would they not want to have somebody in charge of... Ontario is critical. BC is critical in terms of holding the ground they have. Why wouldn't they want somebody who was thinking about the politics of that all the time?
I think there's probably two answers to that. The most obvious answer, when you take a look at you got to go to 2015, I think, to find the answer. And the answer in 2015 probably was, we are going to do things differently. And part of it was trying to departisanize. Now, others may scoff and shrug their shoulders at this, but I think they had an ethic about themselves as a political enterprise. Right? The Justin Trudeau 2015 team, that they were going to departisanize politics, and it would be the best and the brightest and all that kind of thing. And I think that they probably looked upon the idea of political ministers as an anachronism and as something that seemed antithetical to contemporary political management. So I think that's the first answer. And I think the second answer is probably like, who wants competition?
It could just be as practical now, though, because they've increased cabinet, not by a lot, but by 4 or 5 positions. They made up some of these departments. Even I think with the situation that they have in Alberta and Saskatchewan, even if they wanted to change that direction, I think that alone could prevent them from saying we can go ahead with regional ministers, because then you're back at he's having a hard time answer who's going to be responsible for dealing with the premiers right now. Who is going to have political responsibility then for the prairies? I just think it becomes it
becomes a problem with the prairies. But I mean, if I was them, I'd worry about BC. Like, Ontario is one thing. I mean, everybody in the government is in Ontario and thinking about Ontario all the time, right? But nobody in the government's in BC, and nobody's thinking about BC ever, unless somebody forces them, grabs them by the lapels, and says something's going on in BC that you need to care about, right? That's the job of a political minister.
Yeah, I agree with that. But there are lots of people that would be listening to this, and they would think that we sound like dinosaurs for talking this way, right? They think it's crackers that you would have a political minister. They think of it as equivalent to graft and graft machinery. And my argument would be it can be that. It doesn't have to be that.
Right. Okay, more fun. What's a poor choice they made today?
A poor choice. Well, I think a poor choice is to give Chrystia Freeland responsibility for all those things. I would have moved. I put out a Twitter thread yesterday on not what I predicted would happen, but what I thought should happen, and I'm going to stick to it. I think that Chrystia Freeland, to manage the problem that they themselves have identified and said this is the remedy to, should have put her into finance and should have said there she has levers on a budget that can respond to this in terms of economic investment and on defending revision to equalization, which I think is ultimately going to have to occur, and on defending the CPP, QPP, and saying that's a line that we're not going to allow you to cross.
It would all have made more sense from finance, wouldn't it?
And she
it would all have made a lot more sense from finance than from intergovernmental affairs, if that's where her job is.
And don't punish Morneau. Like, it's not, I mean, people think, well, Morneau is a bit gray, but, finance ministers are also supposed to be gray, and they were before we had big, flashy figures like Paul Martin and Jim Flaherty. So there's no harm in that. So put him into foreign. I think he would have been a really good foreign affairs minister because he's
a very nice, kind man.
He's a nice, straightforward, decent, thoughtful guy, and I think he'd be very safe hands there. So I think you could have done a swap there without making it appear as though you were in any way diminishing him or punishing him or admonishing him, and you would have put her in a place where she had tools, and then you didn't have to give her 77 other jobs.
The other question I would ask you about her, you particularly about her, and let me be clear as I ask this question, that I really like Chrystia, and I'm really impressed by Chrystia. So I just want to get that on the table.
I don't know her as well as you do personally, but I'm wildly impressed. So I don't mean this to be critical of her.
Well, my question
I'm
is,
anxious about this situation.
She's also a bit of a technocratic communicator, is she not?
Yes, I would say that.
Right.
And I think EQ is going to be as important as IQ in this job. Because what's really fundamentally going on in Alberta and Saskatchewan, says some big
Belleville boy
dick from Eastern Ontario. But I think what's really going on is an anxiety, right? I mean, isn't that the sense of it, right? Like, it's a sense of like, jeepers creepers, what we do for a living
is going out of style.
And the government is hastening it by virtue of its policy choices to go out of style. And so that's an emotional thing as much as it is an economic thing. And you can have an economic transformation program to try to respond to it, but you're going to have to meet it with some emotion. And I think we're going to have to see that dimension from her, which we don't often see in her public communication. And I don't know, but, I to counter myself, I've had a couple of people I've made this point to say, you don't think she had to show some EQ dealing with those fucking assholes out of the Trump administration and have to, like, when do I swallow shit and smile and listen to these clowns go on and on and on and, like, not break up the meeting and bust the whole thing up by going, my God, you people are terrible. So, there may be deeper wells there than we've seen.
I think she's got the EQ to handle the conversations and the negotiations. I think she needs work as a communicator, as a public communicator. I don't find her terribly compelling. Do you?
No, not really. Yeah, I think she could work on that.
Right. What are they doing at Indigenous Services? So they started off, they split about a year or so into the mandate, the first mandate. They split Diane into two ministries, Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services. And that's because the perception was that Carolyn Bennett had a fantastic relationship with the Indigenous community, but wasn't a strong administrator. Right. And so they wanted to bring somebody in who would run the department and get the stuff done and leave Carolyn to manage the relationships. So that was one thing when they said, and the person that we're going to augment you with is Jane Philpott, who's one of our most impressive ministers.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And she went in there and she immediately started knocking off boil water advisories and all that kind of stuff. And then in there, they moved Seamus O'Regan in there to replace her. So now you're saying to Carolyn Bennett, not that the job you couldn't do can be done by Jane Philpott, but the job you couldn't do can be done, well, pretty much by anybody. And so, and then he's not in there for long, and the election happens, and then now they replace him with Mark Miller, whom I've met. I'm sure he's very bright. He seems like a nice guy. He's a close friend of the Prime Minister's. That's all good. But he's a working minister. So it feels to me like they're downgrading that job.
Well, but this speaks to like it's basically because of Freeland's such the high profileness of her appointment. It actually has taken away from the fact that there have been like many women demoted in this cabinet. So, we spoke earlier about Joyce Murray. She's now the Minister of Digital Government. She was Treasury Board President before.
And Digital Government.
I guess in Digital Government.
Yeah, she was, yeah.
So it's taken away. You have, Christy Duncan and Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor were removed right from cabinet.
Right.
So although there's women in cabinet positions, they're not in positions. There are very few women that are in positions that would be seen as senior ministers or are going to sit on the Environment and Economy Committee or Cabinet Committee, or they're going to sit on P&P. So it just speaks to that in what you're talking about with Bennett. So they've kept her at a communications role or a stakeholder type role and appointed a friend of the Prime Minister.
If I was her, I'd be starting to get offended now. It's one thing to be said, Philpott can do this better than you. It's another thing to say, pretty much anybody in the cabinet can do this.
I think it's a bananas conversation. I don't even understand it.
What do you mean?
This is what she's good at. I think it's a really
I'm
smart
not saying
thing.
they should have put her back in that other thing. I'm saying,
No.
But why are they continually shuffling the services job, which is really where progress needs to be made?
Well, I think I think this is the dominoes of cabinet making. I think there's
Well,
less
so
to
that
this.
means that it's an outer domino that falls because of the core decisions you're making, not a core decision you're making.
Yes, unfortunately, I do think that.
Right.
I do think that, but I think that service delivery in Indigenous affairs is pretty critical. By the way, I actually think this Miller guy's good.
I'm not saying that.
I understand. No, I'm not saying you're
My
not. But
understanding
as a statement to that community, what are they supposed to assume
But
from
my,
that?
my understanding was with Miller, because he was such close friends with the Prime Minister, that's why he wasn't considered in the cabinet in 2015.
No, it's not about him.
I think he's a guy that probably ought to have been in cabinet earlier, but it's another one. He's a white dude, in an urban area. It's tough for him to break through. So I think he could be one of the quiet successes of this cabinet composition 8-9 months from now. And I don't think that Carolyn Bennett has a thing to be complaining about, because if I'm her, I'm like, I've invested, she's almost into a decade of this, right? Between her critic's role, which is what won her the job in the first place in 2015, and her service in that position, where they did a peculiar thing by splitting the ministry almost in order to preserve her role and her relationships as an indication of how much equity she had built up there. And I think it'd be very easy to say, well, Carolyn's getting a little older, let's just move her out. No, I think keeping her in that spot is a good idea. And, I think this Miller guy could be good. I think the more interesting part of the conversation is, wow, so Seamus is Natural Resources Minister now, when we're talking about the oil patch and all that's going on there.
Yeah, I don't get.
He's going to have. I know, and this is what he's going to have a target on his back. They are going to be all over him. You watch. The Conservatives are going to have fundraising emails about that guy right away. And I also think they might be underestimating him.
It's an oddly provocative choice, given that everything else was about making peace and looking like you're trying to build bridges. I found that an oddly provocative choice for that job.
But he's a pretty capable communicator.
But he's someone
and he's a likable
It's not a communications job.
He's someone, but maybe they're going to look at it as a communications job. Maybe the Minister of Pipelines is going to end up being another portfolio. Maybe that's another thing they'll tack on to Freeland. But I think it was pure. I think it was like they knocked him off by he would have the least political baggage or problem. Pipelines are not an issue in Newfoundland and Labrador. Pipelines don't go through there. It's a province that it's a resource development province. People would probably be more supportive. They'd be more supportive of Alberta's position than Quebec by a long shot. And I think that they probably knocked him off by being, we can give him this because it's not going to cause him problems.
At the risk of being coarse, don't you think he's one of a number of ministers who effectively becomes a junior minister to Chrystia Freeland now? That's how I look at it.
Well, we have to see her mandate. But it's starting,
As
you describe it that way, it sounds very sprawling.
Well, for Pete's sake.
Well,
look at the titles associated with her.
Right.
So if I was her, I'd be like, jeepers, I'm anxious about the jobs, expectations, and demands placed upon my shoulders. I'd be like, how?
Well, especially since NAFTA's not a gimme right now.
No, I'd be like, how? No, not crazy orange impeachment monsters screaming on television today. I asked for nothing, right?
And if he loses, he'll lose to people who ostensibly oppose it.
So, if I was her, I'd be like, how do I narrow this playbook? How do I reduce expectations and demand on me?
Close to 40% of the ministers are from the GTHA.
Yep.
Is that an appropriate weighting?
Well, that's where the majority of their caucus is from. They hold the seats here. That's where they have the most to pick from. I think it makes sense. It's
okay.
You know.
And they've loaded up in the GTA. They didn't put Vancouverton in. They must have thought that was a pretty comfortable margin. But they have put a number of other people in from the 905 belt that were ridings that were takeaways from the Conservatives or were new wins in 2015 that you want to hold. So they're clearly, if you look at the cabinet, the Quebec numbers and the 905 numbers, they're setting up for the next election. They've got the defensive bulwark on the 905, and they've got an offensive play with Guilbeault and a revived Jolie and other people, Pablo in Quebec.
Which we all, when we have these conversations, like and it always becomes part of it in all the conversations that I was a part of under the Harper government. Is it really doesn't matter whether someone's in cabinet or not at the end of the day as to whether they're going to win their seat again. Like, nobody knows.
That's right.
Nobody has a clue. Like, I feel bad saying, well, I don't feel bad because I used to say this to cabinet ministers. Nobody knows who you are. Like if you're a good constituency MP, more people know who you are. And if you're shitty, it doesn't matter whether you're in cabinet or not. Outside of usually the finance minister, nobody knows who anyone else is in cabinet. It's people like us, people that are listening to the podcast.
The top ministers would have about 20% awareness levels, the most high-profile ministers, and most of them would fade off into could be confused with anybody in the street territory.
I think even less than that.
Right.
I think even less than that. Like, I think that for us, people recognized. Obviously the Prime Minister, they recognized Jim Flaherty. I think in Ontario, you had recognition of like John Baird, but I think that it was very low.
Yep.
And so, I think Paul Martin was an example of people, he had a high awareness when he was finance minister, because of.
So did Alan Rock. That's why you're a Conservative.
It is. Well, he had a high awareness of law-abiding gun owners who he tried to like turn into criminals. That's what you guys tried to do.
Oh, for Christ's sake! You're not a criminal because you got to buy a license plate for your car.
Oh my goodness. Well, there's a reason the Liberals haven't gone back on that.
Yeah, well.
The
gun registry? Well, more because it cost $2 billion than the fact that it
Listen, there were still...
It was the first Phoenix. It wasn't about the policy. It was about the administration.
There were still signs, remember Bill C-68, that would go up on people's lawns during the election 15 years after.
I know.
I know, but there are people who also say they, like to eat, other people's livers. Like, you gotta, come on. Like, it gets... There's,
So you're comparing law-abiding gun owners to cannibals?
No, I'm not.
Oh my God! This is why you guys appointed.
Hey, I'm from a hunting camp family. Okay.
This is why you guys have a Minister of Rural Affairs from Peterborough.
You're always going to have extremists. Is my point.
I told you in the back room. Peterborough is rural for the Liberal Party. That's as rural as we get.
Well, Kawartha certainly.
One of the things to talk about this is one of the things that was surprising is how much was leaked out ahead of time, and it was obviously staged.
It was very different.
It was
for them,
staged to protect the Freeland thing.
Yeah, and I agree with Scott. But in 15, they kept it closer to their chest until the morning of. We never leaked anything out, and like ministers were warned within an inch of their life. Like after they met with the Prime Minister to find out what their marching orders were, they came and they met with myself and someone else who basically...
What were you doing? You were like cracking your knuckles and swinging a bat going...
No, but you would.
You want to be quiet for a while, Polly.
No, but you'd remind okay, this is what's going to happen on Tuesday. This is how many guests you can bring. I'll follow up with you on this. I'm going to remind you to shut the fuck up because you won't be in cabinet if anyone finds out. And in fact, for one of our shuffles, the incoming minister told his chief of staff where he was going, and it got back to us that there was a very big boozy dinner at High's and where they were talking about offices they were going to take over and what their new address was. And that minister had a different chief of staff when he was sworn in. So it was a very big. It was a very big deal to
God,
keep.
you guys are anti-fun.
You can never talk about. I had a funny experience yesterday where journalists were calling me, and I was saying, "Well, listen, I don't know anything, and these things never leak. Like I've been involved, and the people who know don't." And the journalists were saying, "Really, you want to know who's in?" It was like they knew yesterday.
Yeah.
They were telling me.
Well,
they were telling me on the phone. But the reason you don't talk is because nothing's final till it's final.
Exactly.
Right. When John Turner was putting together his cabinet after the 1984 leadership, there were a couple of young guys from Quebec who had been big supporters of his and had been told that they were going in. And they, the night before, were at the press club and they told people that they were going in. But while they were telling people that they were going in, the negotiations between Turner and Chrystia were still going on. And Chrystia had not agreed to serve in the cabinet. And one of his conditions for agreeing was that he had a list of 3 people from Quebec who had to come in with him. And they bumped out the other 2. So they woke up in the morning and they were not in the cabinet after having told everybody at the press club the night
stories
before.
like that. I hate stories like that because I'm the guy at the bar. I'd be like, you know what the fuck? It's 11 o'clock. I want to let you know something. I'm a big deal. All right? I'm not buying this drink. You're buying that drink. I'm going to be the Minister of National Revenue tomorrow, so fucking get a load of me, right? And then you wake up the next day, you're the Minister of Sweet Fuck Nothing, and there you go. I hate those stories.
We got time for just a little bit more. I'd like to return to an idea Jenny had earlier, which is, does BC have enough clout in this? I mean, the Liberal Party has made, under Justin, a real breakthrough in British Columbia, where we are now a more real party with more ongoing, sustaining support than we've ever been in our history in that province.
Yeah.
A viable competitor with the Conservatives in British Columbia for votes. And one of the things we thought about when we put Emerson in, an ill-fated decision, I'll acknowledge.
And then we put him in.
Right, an ill-fated decision you'll acknowledge. But when we put Emerson in, one of the things we were thinking about was that we'd never seen British Columbia, the Liberal Party hadn't looked on British Columbia as an economy, as a vibrant part of Canada's economy, as a part of the growth of Canada. We'd always put people in social jobs from British Columbia. And I kind of now I'm going to circle back and kind of agree with Jenny in that.
Sorry, what was that?
I'm going to kind of circle back and agree with Jenny that you can call climate change and the environment an economic portfolio, but people who care about the economy probably don't see it as an economic portfolio. And I'm actually wondering whether between Joyce Murray at Digital Economy, Wilkinson at Climate,
Sagen
and
in
Sagen
defense.
at Defense, whether British Columbians are going to see themselves in that cabinet, and whether British Columbians have been treated seriously in that.
And I don't think they will. I've heard from former organizers today who used to work for me, who still do stuff on the ground that not officially in politics, and they're like, this is really fucking shitty. This is a slap in the face. Like there are no economic.
Okay, but which is it? Do ministers not matter sweet fuck nothing, or is it vital? And
but this is but we're not talking. We're not talking about like whether they're going to put the minister of in from Peterborough because it helps her in her seat. We're talking about a government who has a serious problem in Western Canada, who could have given more clout to very capable people. Like Joyce Murray was the president of the Treasury Board. She was the president of the
Joyce.
Okay, well,
Joyce Murray is she had an appropriate spot in the cabinet.
Okay, fine. But they could have made different decisions because they are now a government that the 2 most senior ministers are climate change and environment and national defense, and national defense is not a priority for
BC.
for BC or for you guys. It's it was a relished position within our government, but it's not really for you guys. And the only minister then east of that in Western Canada is the Minister for Northern Affairs. That is it. So you have a Western Canada issue, and they could have addressed it somewhat by making significant decisions or significant decision makers in British Columbia, and they chose not to.
Right. I kind of see that way. You don't?
I think it's a really fair point, and I think it's a point of vulnerability that needs to be monitored. I think there's two things that are different. First of all, actually, I guess then three. So I'll start with this as a piece of context. You and I are older, David.
Older than who?
Well,
Older than what?
Well, we're older than anybody who wasn't thinking about politics in 2003, right? So, I mean, a lot's changed since 2003, and the relationship between
But not the real estate rules.
No.
No.
I think it was Conway Twitty who first sang 15 years ago, and I still think of her. But 15, 16 years ago is a long time ago, and I think the relationship between the Liberal Party and BC has changed. And I think that the Prime Minister thinks that he has a direct personal relationship with that province, and I think that's arguably true. So I think that's a key factor in terms of, do people feel like they're being ignored? I think there's a relationship there. I think he's got the vibe of BC. I think that he feels comfortable there, and I think they are comfortable with him. Not all, but
Lower Mainland, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, not the interior, but
I
the
think
Lower
he
Mainland.
rocks in there.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And I think this last election in some ways demonstrates that, because he was pretty resilient there. I also think that you're underestimating the prominence that Wilkinson will have. I think that if we talk about Freeland as the deputy of the Prime Minister of the country, I think that among all of the other pieces in the cabinet, Wilkinson becomes the wingman for Freeland. And I think that we're going to hear and watch and see and experience a lot of Wilkinson in the next while. So I don't think it will feel like there's been a cabinet indifference to British Columbia, because I think that he's going to be a tall piece of grass out there.
Right. That will be awesome if true, because he's from Saskatchewan. Who's a dark horse who's going to emerge as a star?
I don't know.
What a tough question to ask somebody out of the blue.
I don't know. I think we talked about Marco. I think he was a dark, he was someone until he and his family were walking up the driveway. His name, he had been someone that his name has not been leaked or had not been.
Charles Bird was sitting in my living room assuring me that he was going into the cabinet a couple of days ago, and I thought that was kind of not likely.
Yeah, but Bird sat in your living room 3 years ago and assured you that Marco was in, right? And uncomfortably, he hasn't left your living room since that first time. He's just sitting there smoking weed and watching TV without blinking for
One
3
CFL game
consecutive
to another.
years.
That's all. So we just roll it.
Yeah, so that's there people are talking a lot about the new Anita Anand from Oakville, I think. She actually got a pretty big portfolio for someone newly elected.
Yeah.
She's public services and procurement, so the old public works and government services portfolio. She's another professor that they have in there. So
I think people are going to like Bill Blair at public safety.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think that Blair is an underestimate. I think that guy has horse sense. I think that he's a sensible, balanced guy, and he can smell the room. And you've seen him have to take on those tough jobs of can you go out and consult with a bunch of people that might be upset or might be divided on a bunch of issues and just try to come out of that without being beaten to death? And he has. So I think that guy's got some political game.
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see.
Has
there ever been anybody in the history of humankind that's looked more like a cop than Bill Blair?
No, I think
No.
you said here a blind man could pick him out as a cop.
It's unbelievable. The guy. When he walked up to put his hand on the Bible today, right? He slaps that frying pan down, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll tell you something, right?" He looks like he's cast out of, an old Warner Brothers flick or something.
yeah, but for that reason, he'll give people comfort.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'll be good on things like refugees and stuff. All right, that's our time for today. Thank you both for coming in.
No, this is fun.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks. The three of us, to do a kind of a year. The two of
Three.
you.
There's three. I know you guys like to go for drinks and just say, screw Reid, but
Yeah.
there's three of us.
Well, actually, I've literally never heard Jenni say that. And
That's where we go now.
so we'll be back in a couple of weeks to do kind of a year-end wrap-up. If anybody out there listening has anything they'd like us to address or any questions for that year-end wrap-up, go to the website for the Herle Burly and
Mailbag.
Post that question, and we might answer it or address it. I make no promises or commitments. This is a free-flowing show. Next week, I will be talking to my old dear friend Ralph Goodale, who had an incredibly important and illustrious career in Canadian politics. We'll be reviewing that career and talking about the challenges that lay forward for Canada. So tune in next week for Ralph, and then in 2 weeks for the Jenni and Scott show. Thanks for listening. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and listening. I'd like to thank our sponsors, TELUS and Aurea, for their huge and helpful support to this podcast. I want to thank the Orange Lounge for allowing us to record this episode here, as they always do. And this episode was produced by Jill Engelman and engineered and recorded by Metal Donkersgood. Thanks for listening.
Herle Burly.